After the coup of Brumaire, Napoleon was appointed First Consul. His enormous ambition, combined with support from the military and a belief that he was fulfilling the goals of the revolution, drove him to seize power for himself. He sought to establish an empire that would challenge the great powers of Europe. During the course of this attempt, Europe was plunged into one of the most protracted and bloody conflicts in its history to that date. The successful conclusion of the coup was only the beginning for Napoleon. He had gained political power but needed to consolidate if he were to make himself undisputed ruler of France. He began with yet another constitution. Napoleon spent 6 weeks in careful deliberation with the other two councils until the point of which he had all the power. After these 6 weeks of negotiations, the government of France was transformed from one where the political responsibility was spread as widely as possible to one where it was centralized in the hands of a single man. In a proclamation, Napoleon explained his reasons for seizing power. He said to make the republic loved by its citizens, respected abroad and feared by its enemies. Such are the duties we have assumed in accepting the first consulship. And he added reassuringly that the new constitution was based upon the true principles of representative government and on the sacred rights of property, equality, liberty. The powers it sets up will be strong and lasting. Power was firmly in the hands of one man, who stood alone at the top of the political pyramid. The Senate, which had been intended to act as a brake on the executive, became under Napoleon's leadership an instrument of his personal power. It was intended to be a guardian of the existing constitution, but was also able to amend it by a legal procedure. It was this procedure that Napoleon used extensively from January 1801 onwards in order to block the wishes of the tribunate and the legislature. Senators were appointed for life with a substantial salary, were suitably rewarded with gifts of land and money, and enjoyed considerable prestige. The new constitution was submitted for approval in a plebiscite held in February 1800. It passed by maybe legitimate election, maybe not. In a number of ways, though, this constitution established a framework for consolidating the main social changes brought about by the revolution. Among the most important of these changes was the vast transfer of land that had taken place largely at the expense of the Catholic Church, but also from the nobility. It was necessary to bind the beneficiaries of these transfers to the new regime. This was achieved by creating a political system which favored the well-off propertied classes. Power in the new regime was far more centralized than it had been under the Directory. In a way, it was a reversion back to the Jacobin phase of the Revolution, when France was governed by a dictatorship. By cultivating the support of notables, Napoleon was seeking to incorporate and consolidate the new elite of talent and property that had emerged since 1789. Napoleon only narrowly escaped assassination in December 1800, making the Senate anxiously aware of the fragile nature of the regime dependent for its continuation on one man. Partly because of this and partly as a demonstration of gratitude to the First Consul for his achievements at home and abroad, it was decided to offer him consulship for life, which the right to nominate his successor. It was the first step towards reintroduction of hereditary rule. Napoleon accepted and held a plebiscite vote, which of course passed. Following this plebiscite vote, Napoleon's personal power increased immediately through his control of an enlarged Senate, which became responsible for everything not provided by the Constitution and necessary to its working. This arrangement greatly reduced the power of the representative bodies, the tribunate and the legislature. They lost much of their importance and met less frequently. The tribunate was severely purged in 1802 for daring to criticize the proposed civil code, and with a much reduced membership became little more than a rubber stamp for the remainder of its existence, while the legislature's credibility was reduced by being packed by Napoleon with safe men who would not oppose his wishes. Since 1789, the Catholic Church and the French state had been in conflict. During the Directory, there had been a revival of Catholic worship that no government could safely ignore. Napoleon's motives for seeking a concordant with the Pope were those of expediency. His own attitude to religion was ambivalent. What he appreciated about religion was its power to act as a social bond, cementing together a divided people, and the importance of its official reestablishment and bringing an end to the schism between clergy who had sworn allegiance to the revolution and those who had not. Religious peace would bring about political and social peace to France, as Catholicism had been identified with the royalist cause and needed instead to be identified with the people as a whole. Discussions with the papacy lasted many months before a concordant was finally reached in July of 1801. Under this agreement, the separation of church and state, which had been one of the main policies of the revolution, was to end. The Catholic Church recognized the revolution and agreed no attempt would be made to recover church lands. A state-controlled church was established, and its clergy became paid civil servants, appointed by the government and bound to it by oath. While it was agreed that Catholic worship should be freely exercised in France, it was also agreed that there would be toleration for other faiths under the Concordat. The Concordat was published by Napoleon in April 1802 as part of a wide-ranging ecclesiastical law onto which he tacked the so-called organic articles. These were a series of articles limiting in every possible way papal control over the French bishops, while all at the same time increasing state control over the activities of the clergy. Tensions between church and state, however, remained. Napoleon angered Pope Pius VII by ordering, without reference to him, that the church throughout the empire should celebrate August 16th, the day after his own birthday, as St. Napoleon's Day, unceremoniously removing the calendar of saints that the existing occupant of that date. The cult of the emperor had reached its peak. It was clear that the church was no longer the privileged first estate it had been under the old regime, with its tax exemptions and vast landed estates. There appeared to be very little prospect that either would ever be restored. By 1803, Napoleon was riding in splendor around Paris and holding court in royal style. State ceremonies multiplied. Etiquette was formalized and official dress became more elaborate. The Legion of Honor had been introduced the previous year, and there were hints that a nobility was to be reestablished. The rumors fired by Napoleon's permission for a large number of émigrés to return to France. In 1804, a series of disasters, royalist plots, and counterplots culminated in the affair of the Duc d'Enghien, a member of the Bourbon royal family alleged to be involved in a plot to overthrow Napoleon by murdering him and taking over the government. The Duke was kidnapped on Napoleon's orders while on neutral territory, tried, and, on rather inadequate evidence, found guilty of conspiracy. He was executed quickly in what amounted to judicial murder, justified by Napoleon on the grounds that he was entitled by Corsican laws of vendetta to kill an enemy who threatened his personal safety. In the wake of these events, Napoleon began to prepare people for the next step. There was widespread talk of making the consulship hereditary within the Bonaparte family, in the hope of providing for smooth succession and the survival of the Constitution should Napoleon meet an untimely death. Then in May 1804, a formal motion was approved by the Senate that Napoleon Bonaparte, at present First Consul, be declared Emperor of the French, and that the imperial dignity be declared hereditary in his family. A third plebiscite held in November 1804 approved the change. Remembering that 40% of the army voted 2 years earlier had rejected this proposal, the government took no chances this time and did not actually poll the soldiers. They simply added an approximately 500,000 yes votes on their behalf. To seal his transformation of the consulship to that of hereditary ruler, Napoleon planned a spectacular coronation to be held at Notre Dame on the 2nd of December 1804. In the presence of the Pope, Napoleon, as previously arranged, crowned himself emperor and then crowned Josephine as empress. During the next 2 or 3 years, the tribunate and the legislature were hardly consulted at all. The tribunate was finally abolished in 1808, and although legislators survived, it was only able to do so by maintaining a subservient attitude to Napoleon's demands. Government was increasingly conducted through the Senate and the Council of State, both of which were firmly under Napoleon's personal control. To understand the importance of this event, it's important to understand papal control over monarchs throughout European history. Basically, if you were a king and the Pope was present, the Pope would crown you. And what this said was, I, as the anointed one on earth for God, appoint you king. It was a very powerful tool of popes. They could use it to lift up a king or tear one down, as they did with John I in England. You know, the Pope had a lot of power over these monarchs, but now it's 1804, and Napoleon is a different kind of king. He's self-made. And so as a result, you can see in this painting just how historic this event is. Here's the Pope right here. He's sitting as just another person. Like, he doesn't even have the honor of standing like Napoleon's ministers right here are, or his family having a front view. Or this is pretty funny. This is actually depicting as Napoleon's about to crown Josephine, and these are Napoleon's sisters having to hold her robe, and they hated her. They absolutely hated her. So, you know, they're forced into this situation which they don't like, and so Napoleon's about to put the crown on. But before this event, you see Napoleon crowning himself. The importance of that is just undeniable. It was agreed to before that, but Napoleon's just going to say, look, you didn't make me emperor. I made myself emperor, and I will put this on my own head. It was the first time in European history this had happened. And by the way, he kind of kidnapped the Pope and forced him to come here. So this Pope, Pope Pius VII, is not very happy right now. All that remained to establish the Napoleonic dynasty was an heir to the throne. In the years following his coronation, it became increasingly obvious that the aging Josephine was unable to provide him with an heir. Despite his continued fondness for her, Napoleon needed a divorce. He also had to persuade the church to grant this. This was not easy, for although their original marriage was a civil ceremony, the church had insisted on a second Catholic ceremony before Josephine could be crowned empress. Eventually, by 1810, on the grounds of alleged irregularities in the conduct of the religious marriage, the church unwillingly agreed to an annulment, leaving Napoleon free to remarry. A list of 18 eligible princesses was drawn up for him, and later that year, at the age of 40, he married Maria Louise of Austria, a niece of Marie Antoinette. In the following year, the hoped-for son and heir, Napoleon II, King of Rome, was born. The succession seemed assured, the dynasty secure. Napoleon maintained power using the two most important agents of control, which were the police and the prefects. For much of the Napoleonic era, the Minister of Police was Joseph Fouché. Both police and prefects had very wide-ranging powers. They acted as trained spies, imposed censorship, set up surveillance of possible subversives, searched for army deserters, and organized raids on areas believed to be sheltering draft dodgers or enemy agents. They were assisted in the maintenance of law and order by a well-organized body of soldiers. In 1810, there were 18,000 of these police-type soldiers stationed throughout France. Reports were submitted to Napoleon daily by Fouché on the work of his department. They had a prefect assisted by sub-prefects for each department. Other local officials, such as mayors and all the municipal councils, were nominated by the prefect. In addition to their official duties, like tax collection and conscription, prefects were expected to spread propaganda, monitor public opinion in their areas, and to report on any suspicious political activity. Suspects could be placed under house arrest. With such a well-organized surveillance, it is not surprising that the regime met with little serious political opposition, especially as its potential leaders, notables, intellectuals, and members of the bourgeoisie were increasingly tempted into allying themselves with the government in the hope of a reward. The French legal system was extremely complex, with different systems operating in different parts of France. Although the revolution had swept away many of the complexities, there was still considerable scope for further reform. Napoleon took an active interest in the formulation of the new civil code, which was issued in March 1804 and renamed in 1807 Code Napoleon. Among the most important sections of the code were those relating to individual rights and property rights. The code recognized the legal rights of those who had benefited from the purchase of confiscated church and noble lands. This was an attempt to bind them into maintaining the regime. The system of inheritance of an estate introduced during the Revolution, where all male heirs, inherit a portion of that estate versus just the eldest male, was also confirmed. While the civil code maintained some of the most important gains of the revolution, the abolition of feudalism, the removal of the privileged position of the Catholic Church within the state, freedom of conscience and equality before the law, it was also illiberal and restrictive. Napoleon took a personal part in preparing those sections that dealt with family law. He was intent on strengthening the authority of the father and the husband who could send an adulterous wife or defiant child to prison. Divorce, although permitted in theory, was made very difficult and expensive to obtain. Among the code's most illiberal measures were those relating to the treatment of enslaved people in the colonies and their workers. Slavery was reintroduced in the French colonies in accordance with the laws current in 1789, meaning they went back to being enslaved after having a period of freedom. Also, all workmen were made subject to close police supervision through the use of what is known as a livret, without which it was illegal to obtain a job. Like a number of Napoleon's achievements, there were two sides to the civil code. While it acknowledged many of the gains made during the Revolution, it also confirmed the reaction against the achievements of the Republic through a return to a more authoritarian and restrictive legal system. Napoleon used both censorship and propaganda to maintain power. He also put in the civil code, which benefited him and gave him even more power, and heavily influenced education in order to maintain power. He also used a system of bribery to get powerful men on his side, and reforms and repression, of course, using the police and execution as his tools. Certainly, he expected the French press to issue all propaganda, and then he opened a wider field of cultural achievements in order to more control society. For instance, all books, plays, lectures, and posters that appeared in Paris had to be approved by Napoleon. He also reformed education. He believed that education had two main functions, and that was to provide the state with a ready supply of civilian officials and administrators and loyal and disciplined army officers. He intended to recruit these from among the sons of the property-owning classes. And the second reason for an education was to bind the nation closer together, an aim that could only be fulfilled if the government took direct control over the system. So yet another area in which Napoleon will do. He'll also make an agreement with the Catholic Church, which was very popular. And lastly, he uses a system of voting in which he can manipulate that vote, of course, but it gives him the apparent okay from the French population. Although the official birth of the empire was on May 18, 1804, when Napoleon proclaimed himself hereditary emperor of the French, in reality it had started its unofficial life long before then, with the revolutionary conquest and those of the Consulate. Both of these had pushed the frontiers of old France out towards its natural frontiers and beyond. The empire is often referred to as a single entity embracing all French-controlled Europe. In reality, it was a more complicated arrangement than that. The French Empire, properly speaking, was France and its natural frontiers like the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. The annexed territories that were ruled from Paris, such as Piedmont, Parma, Tuscany, the Papal States, the Illyrian provinces, and after 1810, the Netherlands, and a semicircle of nominally independent satellite states ruled by Frenchmen, usually Bonaparte relatives, which formed a buffer zone protecting the borders of French Empire from attack. These states, combined with the French Empire proper, formed the Grand Empire. At various times, these included Switzerland, the kingdoms of Spain, Naples, and Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, and until 1810, the Netherlands and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. These lands acted as a barrier to Russian expansionism into Central Europe. In Northern Europe, Sweden came under the French influence when it was compelled to operate the continental system, which was an embargo against Great Britain, and accept one of Napoleon's marshals as heir to the throne. So this is the extent of Napoleon's empire. By 1812, he's significantly increased France, as you can tell by the green right here, taking over the Netherlands and then parts of Italy, which again has not been unified yet, so it's different kingdoms. And then here again is parts of France as well. And now you've got this buffer zone right here of annexed countries that he put his different brothers and brother-in-laws in power in different areas. And here's Poland. Here's what's left of Poland right here. Not going to be there that long, though. And here are the either enemies or allies of Napoleon, Prussia and Austria. Napoleon's biggest concern, though, was Russia, which might explain why he blundered into it starting in 1812. And of course, this is his downfall. And the reason why is, well, Russian winter. All Russia has to do is flee this way, right, and burn everything in their path as they leave. And then you leave Napoleon exposed to the brutal winter, and that's what happened. And that's really his downfall. That's when it begins, at least. Of the great powers, Austria, Prussia, and Russia were each from time to time brought by military or diplomatic pressures into Napoleon's direct sphere of influence, and each in turn became his ally, although not always willingly and only for a limited period. Only the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain, among the European powers, remained always outside Napoleon's control. Napoleon's own explanation for the need to expand his territories was to protect the territory of revolutionary France from attack by the old monarchies of Europe. He also wanted to export the civil cord, the concordat, and other benefits of Napoleonic rule to the oppressed peoples of neighboring states. He wanted to provide oppressed peoples with liberty, equality, and prosperity, to ensure the end of the old regimes in Europe, and to provide guarantees to citizens everywhere in the empire against arbitrary government action. By doing arbitrary government action. In conclusion, Napoleon had a plan and he implemented it. He went from a lowly corporal all the way to Emperor of France by 1804. Historians have argued at length over what really drove Napoleon to then create an empire. Some believe that Napoleon's conquest offered him opportunities to exploit the territories not only to secure his military domination, but also to reorganize the civil life of annexed lands, and that his imperial vision was a natural extension of his personal dynastic ambition. He was also determined to place as many of his close family and allies either on the thrones of newly conquered countries or to administer them. Napoleon hoped that this would ensure complete loyalty to him. In the case of Spain, this policy proved disastrous.